At more than 3,000 meters above sea level, in the thin air of the northern Andes, a quiet lake less than 500 meters across helped convince Europe that a city of solid gold was real. Yet from this small circle of water, a story spread over 7,000 kilometers across the Atlantic and sank so deep into the European imagination that men chased it for nearly 300 years. How does something so small create an obsession that big? Picture yourself at the edge of that lake as the first light of day appears. There are no walls, no towers, no shining domes, just still water and the faint hint of metal somewhere beneath the surface. This is where the legend of El Dorado truly begins, not with a lost city, but with a ritual on a lonely Andean lake that most people today have never heard of. Why isn't this the starting point when we talk about cities of gold and conquest? Welcome to the Nocturne History, where mystery meets the edge of sleep. Tonight, we drift into the highlands of northern Colombia, tracing the slow first steps of a story that will send armored men into the jungle. Whether you're here to learn, to let your mind wander, or simply to settle in and let the past hum in the background, stay close to the shoreline for now. We'll follow the glow on the water, meet the people who lived with this lake every day, and watch how a sacred ceremony turned into the most dangerous rumor of the New World. For the people who lived here long before any European ship appeared, this lake was not a vault waiting to be cracked open. It was sacred ground. Paths cut across hillsides, linking small fields to the water's edge. Not for profit, for balance. The idea of draining the lake for treasure? That would sound like blasphemy, not cleverness. What kind of eyes look at a place of worship and see only something to empty? Gold for them is not money first. It is a way to catch the power of the sun and send it back. Small figures and thin sheets shine on altars and in shrines. Fires burn along the shore on the day a new ruler takes power. On a wooden raft in the shallows, the new leader stands with his skin coated in ground gold that catches the first strong rays of the sun, turning him into a moving patch of light. To someone seeing this, is it devotion or a glimpse of unimaginable riches? At his feet sit bowls and baskets of offerings, worked gold, emeralds from nearby mountains, fine cotton cloth. The raft pushes away from shore. The lake is not large, you could cross it in a few minutes, but in this moment it feels like a line between worlds. One by one, the treasures go over the side. Gold hits the lake and vanishes. Emeralds flash green and are gone. Finally, the leader lowers himself into the water, washes the gold from his skin, and returns to shore, no longer shining. To the people watching, the ritual has done what it was meant to do. The brightness has moved under the surface. The powers below have been honored. The new ruler has taken his place. Nothing here suggests a city or a palace, let alone an empire of metal. But now imagine this scene described secondhand and half understood. An interpreter explains it to a soldier, the soldier to a scribe who has never left the coast. With each retelling, the story changes shape. How long before a ritual turns into a rumor? A man covered in gold, they say. A lake full of treasure. Offerings thrown into the water every time a new ruler takes power. The living offering becomes a king. The ritual lake becomes a vault. By the time these stories cross the ocean and reach Spain, they are no longer just curious notes in a report. They become possibilities. In ports like Seville and Cadiz, men talk about a northern land where gold is so common it is tossed into a lake. In those noisy rooms, are they really hearing a sacred act or a promise waiting to be claimed? Columbus sailed west in 1492 and found islands. A few decades later, Cortés took Tenochtitlan after a campaign that shocked Europe. If such cities exist in one part of this new world, why not another? On maps sketched in dim rooms, someone writes two words beside the blank upper reaches of South America: El Dorado. At first, that name doesn't mean a city at all. In Spanish, it simply means the Gilded One, the man covered in gold. It is a title, not a place. But words slide easily when they seem to point toward a fortune. Soon, El Dorado can mean the lake, or the surrounding valley, or a kingdom hidden beyond the next range of mountains. A single figure turns into a landscape, then into a destination. Each shift adds another step between the original ceremony and the dream being sold to restless captains and ambitious courtiers. The cracks in the foundation are already there, but no one in those crowded ports wants to see them. How many lives will hinge on that small change in meaning? For now, we are still at the water's edge, in the years before armor and banners appear on these paths. The people around this lake are thinking about their crops, their families, and the spirits they believe move through the hills. They know nothing of faraway courts or maps inked with promises in their name, but the story that will change their world has already begun. Step up from the shoreline to the high plateau, into the fields and trading paths of the Muisca, and walk into the everyday world that gave birth to El Dorado long before Europe knew its name. When the first Spaniards reached these uplands in the 1530s, they found something they never expected: a cold plateau that may have held between 1 and 3 million people, spread across hundreds of villages, and yet no pyramids, no stone walls, no grand ruins for textbooks to fix on. Their world stretched over roughly 25,000 square kilometers of high fields, salt mines, and lakes. And still, in most tellings of El Dorado, this entire civilization is reduced to a single glittering lake and a rumor about gold. How can a story this big hide behind a legend about a city that never existed? Stand for a moment on that plateau, more than 2,600 meters above sea level, where the air is thin. The ground under your feet is not jungle. It's open farmland, cut into plots of maize and potatoes, with smoke rising from thatched houses on low slopes. Life here follows the rhythm of the fields and the seasons, not the march of armies or the clash of empires. So how did such an ordered, everyday place become the seed of one of the wildest myths of the New World? Families tend terraces built on old lake beds, soil rich from water that vanished thousands of years before. Harvests planned by calendars tracking sun and moon. Precision, not mystery. The Muisca don't see themselves at the edge of something impossible. They see balance. Sky, earth, water. Yet within decades, outsiders will call this same land a treasure map. What changed? The land, or the story laid over it? Their strength doesn't come only from the fields. Beneath the hills are veins of salt, boiled down in clay pots at places like Zipaquira and Nemocan into heavy cakes that are easier to carry than grain and more desirable than metal in many nearby regions. Every few days, markets open around the plateau. Salt, cotton cloth, ceramics, and food move in every direction along well-worn roads. Chroniclers would later say these people were more traders than fighters, and in that steady movement of goods and gossip, you can already feel a future legend gathering fuel. How else could a story about one high lake spread so far, so quietly? Gold, interestingly, is not dug in great quantities from this high ground. Much of it comes from warmer valleys and neighboring peoples, traded in for salt or cloth or emeralds, then melted, mixed with copper into tembaga, and shaped into thin plates, nose ornaments, and small figures called tunjos. These are not coins to be counted. They are messages sent to unseen forces that control rain, harvest, and fate. When you see gold as a way to talk to the gods, throwing it into a lake makes sense. When you see gold as money, it looks insane. That clash of meanings sits right at the heart of El Dorado and quietly challenges accepted history about who was truly obsessed with gold. The landscape itself is sacred. Hills, rocks, and especially lakes are tied to stories about origins and disasters, creation and punishment, and some lakes are said to be the homes of spirits who must be honored so they don't unleash floods or famine. Offerings are made at the water's edge: cloth, food, small figures of precious metal. A lake is not an empty container waiting to be drained. It is more like a living mouth that can accept gifts or refuse them. So what happens when strangers arrive who see only wasted wealth lying in the mud? Politically, this world is not a single empire, but a patchwork of allied chiefdoms. Hunza in the north, Bekata in the south, a sacred city in the east. Each chief rules their own territory, but they share language, customs, and a sense of being part of the same people, and their wars are small raids rather than continent-shaking conquests. This loose confederation doesn't fit the narrative of huge stone capitals and marching armies, so it often gets pushed to the margins of great civilization stories. Yet every field, market, and shrine on this plateau is quietly supporting a ritual that will one day be retold as the heart of El Dorado. In the markets, news travels with salt and cloth. A traveler from the lowlands brings word of distant rivers. Stories move like cargo. A messenger reports alliances and disputes. A craftsman boasts about a lake offering, the weight of gold thrown in, the sun catching metal before it sank. No one here imagines these details will cross the ocean, but they will. Every retelling adds emphasis, or leaves something out. Slowly, a pattern emerges. Whenever a new ruler takes power, he must go to a deeper, colder lake and prove the world beyond accepts him. From the outside, that sounds less like balance, more like the key to a vault. When that day comes, the people understand every step. Why gold dust is ground so fine, why emeralds are chosen, why a raft must glide out toward the darkest part of the water. For them, this is continuity, not spectacle. But for a frightened interpreter trying to explain it, or a soldier eager for reward, it can become the story of a man covered in gold standing over a lake full of treasure. So before we see that man, we have to understand the world beneath his feet. The plateau, the salt, the trade, the quiet belief that turns a small lake into the center of everything. Step toward the shoreline at dawn, as fires are lit and gold dust is prepared, and watch as a single human being begins to turn, in other people's minds, into El Dorado himself. Around the 1530s, every new chief of this highland world had to do something that sounded impossible to foreign ears. He stepped naked onto a wooden raft, was covered in ground gold from head to toe, and floated toward the center of a lake only about 400 meters across but more than 50 meters deep. At his feet stood bowls filled with gold figures and bright emeralds. By the end of the ceremony, all of it, the dust on his skin, the metal, the stones, lay on the lake floor. For Europeans who later heard this story in pieces, it sounded less like worship and more like a riddle. Who pours treasure into deep water on purpose? Before sunrise, the lakeshore burns with firelight. Torches form a ring along the edge, their reflections shaking on the dark surface. Families arrive from nearby villages, wrapped against the cold, thin air more than 2,600 meters above sea level. Priests move through the crowd, checking offerings and watching the sky. Everyday gifts, food, drink, cloth, sit farther from the water. Closest to the shore lie the guarded things, small gold figures, bright green stones, carefully wrapped bundles. Some of that metal has traveled 100 or 200 kilometers from warmer valleys. To an outsider, it looks like wealth about to be thrown away. To the people gathering here, it is a conversation about to begin. What kind of reply are they hoping for? Up in a nearby house, behind reed walls, the chief is being remade. Gold, once cast as solid pieces, is ground on stone slabs until it is dust fine. Mixed with oils, it is pressed onto his skin by steady hands. Grain by grain, it clings to his arms, chest, and face until he no longer looks like a man in ornaments, but like a single shining figure. He is not dressing to show off. He is turning himself into an offering. Everyone there knows the brightness on his body already belongs to the lake. Seen from inside the culture, this is duty. Heard secondhand across an ocean, it will sound like madness. When he walks down toward the shore, the sound changes. Conversations fade. Flutes and drums keep playing, but softer now, like a slow heartbeat under the scene. Firelight catches on the gold that covers him, throwing quick flashes across the water. Behind him, attendants lift bowls of tunjos and emeralds so the crowd can see what is about to be lost. The chief steps onto the raft. Nobles follow. Polemen push off, and the platform slides away from land. Is this a display of strength, or a warning that strength depends on what you can give up? Out on the lake, the world narrows to sky, water, and the small group on the raft. The shore falls back into a low ring of fire and faces. One by one, attendants lift each offering and tip it into the water. There are no speeches, only the splash of metal and stone and the slow pulse of drums. At the deepest point, servants pour cold water over the chief's head and shoulders, washing the gold from his skin in sheets that slide off and sink. In seconds, he changes from a gleaming figure into a bare, shivering man. For those watching, that sudden change is the proof they need. He has given back what was never truly his. If you see all this, the grinding of gold, the fear of angering what lives in the water, you do not walk away imagining a city of solid metal. You remember a small lake, a fragile raft, and a ruler who must give more than he keeps. The people who will spread this story never witness the whole scene. Spanish soldiers and scribes hear it in fragments. A guide's quick tale, a captive's half-hidden memory, an interpreter forcing strange beliefs into a few simple words. What happens to a ceremony when it is pushed through a channel that narrow? Some parts survive the journey. A man covered in gold, a lake that receives offerings, chiefs repeating the same act. Other parts fall away, the sense that gold speaks to unseen forces, and that certain lakes are beings, not vaults. Without those layers, the tale becomes something else, a place where gold is poured into water again and again, and no one takes it back out. From that gap between meaning and description, a new word hardens. El hombre dorado, the golden man, becomes El Dorado. At first, it names a person, not a land, but names stretch, and in a few short years, a title turns into a destination. That quiet shift challenges accepted history about what El Dorado was meant to be. The people who stand shivering on the plateau after the fires burn low never use that name. For them, the ritual has done its work and they go home. The story of what they saw does not stay with them. It follows traders and guides toward warmer valleys, then moves north along rivers to the Caribbean coast. From there, it rides on ships and in letters bound for Spain, into crowded ports and noisy taverns where men fresh from the conquests of the Aztecs and the Incas are ready to believe. In that noise, a ritual on a high, cold lake becomes something else, a rumor about a place where gold is thrown into the water because there is too much of it. Within 45 years of 1492, men in Spain were already whispering about a lake 7,000 kilometers away where gold was not mined, but thrown into the water and left there. The core of the story hardly changed. A ruler coated in gold dust, A ceremony on a high Andean lake, bowls of treasure sinking into deep water. No one had a map, no one had proof, yet captains were ready to risk weeks at sea on this rumor alone. How does a small ritual meant to give wealth up turn into Europe's most tempting story about a place no one has ever seen? On the plateau, the meaning is clear. A chief offers metal and emeralds so the world stays in balance. But once that image travels, it breaks apart. Guides tell soldiers, soldiers tell scribes. Each retelling strips away a layer. Sacred motives fall away. Numbers remain. Bowls of gold, handfuls of emeralds. A lake that's never emptied. On the Caribbean coast, a local ally traces circles in dust. His words pass through one nervous interpreter. The fear of spirits fades, the metal stays. How different does a belief look once only its price tags are left? Months later, one of those men waits in a port like Santo Domingo or Havana for a ship home. Nights are long, and stories are the cheapest entertainment. With a drink in his hand and a small audience, he tells the tale again. The lake grows deeper. The bowls of gold grow heavier. Each new ruler now seems to pour piles of treasure into the water. He is not trying to forge a legend, he is trying to make men listen. Then, on the 40 to 60 days of sailing that follow, he repeats the same tale under a strip of stars on the Atlantic. By the time land appears, the story has settled into a neat pattern. A lake, a ritual, and a fortune waiting in the dark where no one has yet dared to dive. Once a story fits that neatly, who bothers to ask what parts went missing? In Seville, the rumor hits paper. Finally, something solid. At the Casa de Contratación, clerks process cargo lists, royal orders, reports, mountains of documents. Somewhere in that pile, a report about rich highlands, a ceremony of gold on a lake. To most clerks, just another line to copy. To ambitious men nearby, an opening. They've seen fortunes appear from less. Mexico started as ink on a chart. So did Peru. Why not this lake? Cartographers draw coasts first. Interior stays blank, unknown lands. Then one hears the talk. He inks a name, El Dorado. At the same time, shipboard talk shortens El Hombre Dorado to just El Dorado. A title becomes a place. A ritual becomes a kingdom. And almost no one notices that one shining man has been promoted into an empire. By the late 1530s, Spain is full of men who have seen the impossible become real. Some watched Hernán Cortés bring down Tenochtitlan in less than 2 years. Others heard how Francisco Pizarro seized Atahualpa and demanded a ransom that filled a room more than 6 meters long with gold and silver. These are not distant legends, they are fresh memories. Against that backdrop, a highland lake that regularly swallows gold doesn't sound absurd. It sounds like the missing third chapter after Mexico and Peru. So, in Seville's taverns and cramped upstairs rooms, veterans of the New World begin to gather, comparing scars and scratching quick maps on tabletops. A river here, a line of hills there, an empty inland space labeled El Dorado. From these quiet nights will come petitions to the crown, bargains between captains, and the first serious plans to march inland, plans led by men who hope that this rumor of a golden land will finally turn their own names into something that outlives them. How many of them are really chasing gold, and how many are trying to outrun the lives they left behind? In the 1540s, one expedition marched into the interior of South America with more than 500 men and came back with fewer than 100. The survivors were half-starved, sick, and nearly empty-handed, carrying more scars than silver. Yet when they reached Spanish ports, other captains didn't point to them and say, "Never again." They said they went the wrong way. Give me a chance and I'll find the real El Dorado. What kind of fever makes men look at wreckage and see a missed opportunity? Across Spain, the timing cuts deep. In less than 50 years since Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, three American powers have already been broken or swallowed. Cortés and Pizarro turned short campaigns into legends and bought themselves a place in history before turning 60. Younger captains walk the same streets, carry the same swords, and feel that history has already moved past them. To them, El Dorado is not a childish story. It feels like the last door that might still open. When the age of miracles seems to be ending, who wants to accept that they arrived too late? Step into a small room above a noisy tavern in Seville. Sounds from below seep through floorboards, carts rattling, sailors shouting. At a rough table, three men lean over parchment, a veteran of Mexico, a younger captain with no conquest, a scribe ready to turn dreams into official requests. They speak of rich provinces and new lands to pacify. The word hiding behind every sentence, El Dorado. Greed is there. They know what gold can do. But underneath sits something quieter, the fear of fading out. Time itself feels like an enemy. When you're running out of years, how easy is it to doubt the rumor you need to be true? From rooms like this, the dream moves into council chambers. In Madrid and Valladolid, officials hear a stream of petitions that all sound strangely similar. Each promises to pacify new territories, convert new souls, and send fresh revenues home in exchange for the right to lead a force inland. The name El Dorado may not appear in the neat lines of ink, but everyone knows which shadow hangs over phrases like a very rich land or a province of great abundance. How many times can a rumor be dressed as policy before someone dares to call it by its true name? Royal licenses are granted to some, denied to others. With a few lines of approval, a captain suddenly has the power to recruit men, demand supplies, and borrow money against a future that exists only as hearsay. Merchants in port cities pull out ledgers and start writing numbers beside his name. Swords, armor, horses, dogs, arquebuses, barrels of food. Every item will have to be paid back with profit. If the expedition fails, the debt remains. Ink does not vanish just because a man dies far from home. Long before anyone touches a vine or a muddy riverbank, the rumor has already wrapped itself around their wallets. The jungle has not yet taken a single life, and already this story owns their sleep. As recruitment begins, the fever spreads downward. In dockside taverns, ordinary soldiers hear that a new entrada is being raised to go after the Gilded Lord in the interior. Some sign on because they have nothing to lose. They've already wasted years on guard duty in tiny coastal forts. Others join because they can't stand the thought that another man their age might find El Dorado and come back rich while they are still stuck watching barrels. In a world where fortune seems to favor the bold, who wants to be the one who stayed behind? Far from the noise of recruitment, in a mapmaker's workshop, the outlines of South America are starting to settle into place. The coasts are no longer guesswork, they've been traced by real voyages and pinned with names. Inland, where rivers knot together and the hills turn to haze, there is still room for imagination. The cartographer adds a few more strokes based on the latest reports. A mountain range here, a large river there, a note about fertile lands beside a blank patch of paper. Somewhere in that soft space he writes El Dorado in careful letters. It isn't evidence, it is a quiet promise that someone, soon, will bleed to test. Soon those thin ink lines harden into orders. Drums beat in the plazas of New World towns as newly licensed captains assemble their men. On the table in the captain's quarters lies a copy of the map that shows the coast clearly and the interior as a suggestion. He taps the place where rumor says the plateau lies. He traces a straight line from his starting point to that empty patch as if drawing it can make it real. A line on paper can ignore mountains and floods. The path waiting outside the walls will not. Until now, all of this, the petitions, the debts, the whispered promises, has happened in rooms with walls and roofs. The danger is still theoretical. The air is dry, the ground is solid. Gold is only a word, not yet a weight on anyone's shoulders. But that is about to change. Now step away from the map tables and council chambers and follow these men as they leave the high, cool plateau behind and walk down into the green labyrinth that does not care whether their dreams live or die. In some parts of the northern Amazon, a marching column can spend an entire day cutting just 2 or 3 kilometers of path through the trees. The men who left the highland town with El Dorado in their heads didn't know that. On their first morning down from the plateau, they expected to cover 20 kilometers, maybe more. By the end of the week, some days barely moved them 5. The jungle wasn't fighting them the way an army would. It was simply there, thick and endless, and that was somehow worse. The descent begins gently enough. The air warms, the horizon lifts into a hazy line of hills, and the neat cobbled paths of the plateau give way to dirt tracks winding through the foothills. At first, the men talk loudly about the rich valleys ahead. They still sleep in villages, still see cleared fields, still find firewood without effort. But each day the trees grow closer together, taller, louder with insects. The sky narrows. One night, a soldier looks back and realizes he can no longer see any part of the highlands they came from. At what point did retreat quietly stop being an option? Soon, the last cultivated fields vanish. Now the only road is the one they make. At the head of the column, a file of men swings heavy blades into roots and vines from dawn until dusk. Armor that was useful on the plateau becomes dead weight in the heat. More than one man forgets a breastplate beside a stream. They had imagined marching across open ground, 15 or 20 kilometers in a day. Instead, one stretch of forest takes 3 days to cross. Every extra day means more food gone, more boots rotting. How long before the math stops working? Guides walk just ahead of the cutters. Some hired, some allied, some taken along by force. They know river names, hill shapes, old stories. When asked where the Golden Lord lives, hands often point in the same general direction, east or southeast, toward heavier air and darker trees. But under pressure, answers start to change. One man swears the kingdom lies along a great river. Another insists it stands on a high plain beyond the forest. Each believes or pretends to believe what will keep him alive that day. If your only compass is a frightened man's finger, how sure can you ever be of your course? At night, the captains spread rough maps on damp cloth and try to fit what they've seen into what they were told. The lines drawn in Spain looked clean. Down from the plateau, through the forest, to the rich lands beyond. Here, the rivers don't match the sketches. Hills rise where the paper said there would be savanna. The men tracing routes with candlelight are the same ones who once spoke so confidently before royal councils. Now the edges of the map feel less like a border and more like a warning. The environment works on them in quieter ways too. Rain doesn't fall in brief storms. It lingers, sometimes for hours, sometimes all day, soaking clothes, rotting packs, turning the ground into a slick mess. The air stays heavy even after dark. Insects whine constantly. At first, they slap and curse and joke about it. After a month of it, the sound of wings around the ears at night is enough to make tempers snap. The jungle doesn't need to attack them outright. It just grinds away, one uncomfortable hour at a time. Rivers become both lifeline and trap. The first time the column reaches a wide brown channel, 200 meters across, hope flares. Water means fish, easier movement, a break from hacking through roots. They fell trees to build rough canoes, lash rafts together for the horses and dogs. Sliding onto the current feels like progress again. But rivers choose their own paths. A stream that seems to bend toward the plateau on the map might actually loop for hundreds of kilometers through low, flooded forest. If the current carries you the wrong way for even 3 or 4 days, how easily can you claw your way back? On land, direction is no easier. The forest floor offers few landmarks. Trees look similar. Valleys repeat. A man can circle for an hour and come back to his own footprints without realizing it. Smoke from campfires vanishes into the canopy. The stars are hidden most nights. Compasses tell you where north is, but not where water lies, or game, or the next patch of dry ground. The word labyrinth didn't appear on any royal license they carried, yet that is what the land quietly becomes. As the days lengthen into weeks, the men start to talk less about El Dorado and more about simple things. Dry socks, good water, the last time they saw open sky. Still, the name they came for never fully disappears. It whispers at the edge of every complaint. When someone grumbles about the mud, another reminds him that there is no easy road to a city of gold. When a man hesitates in front of yet another flooded thicket, a captain points forward with his sword and says that the next ridge could be the last barrier before fortune. How many times can just a little farther be said before it stops working? Losses begin in ones and twos, not in battles, but in small, ugly moments. A man slips on a wet slope and breaks a leg. The column moves on without him. Another staggers with fever for days and then doesn't wake up one morning. Packs fall into rivers. Powder is ruined. A horse breaks through a hidden sinkhole and has to be killed. None of these events feels like a disaster on its own. Together, they slowly pull the expedition's strength down, like weight added grain by grain to a sagging rope. Through it all, the jungle gives nothing back. There are no enemy banners to chase, no walls to judge progress against, no messengers from the kingdom they seek. Only more green, more water, more buzzing. A few men start to wonder aloud whether the land is protecting something or if the stories of the Gilded Lord were meant as punishment, not promise. Others clamp down on that kind of talk, knowing that doubt can spread faster than any sickness. Is the maze hiding a prize, or is the maze all there ever was? By the time the first supplies are truly low, the expedition has done more than cross a boundary on a map. It has stepped into a place where distance and direction no longer mean what they did in Europe or on the plateau. The clean lines drawn in Spain have dissolved into loops of river and knots of trees, but this is only the beginning of the unraveling. Now we stay with these columns as their food rots, their arguments sharpen, and the easy short route they were promised stretches into months on the water, with El Dorado always just beyond the next bend in the river. In their orders back in Spain, one famous entrada was supposed to take no more than 6 months. 2 years later, fragments of the same expedition were still drifting along unnamed rivers, half-starved and empty-handed. The short route they had been promised kept stretching, bend after bend, into something that felt like it had no end at all. At what point does a journey stop being a plan and start becoming a trap? The unraveling doesn't begin with a single disaster. It starts with small delays that no one worries about. An extra day spent repairing rafts, a swollen river that forces them to camp on the bank, a hillside that takes longer to climb than the map suggested. When you've carried rations for 6 months and you're suddenly in the 7th, which number do you trust? The one in the ledger or the one in your stomach? In the heat and humidity, supplies betray them first. Salted meat that should have lasted weeks sours in a few days. Cloth sacks rot where they touch the ground. Each little failure erases a bit more of the safety they thought they had. Powder clumps and fails to fire. Men start leaving heavy things behind. A spare helmet, a coil of rope, a dented breastplate. How do you make good decisions when the tools you need are lying behind you in the mud? Hunger changes the way they look at the land. Hunting parties go out and return with almost nothing. Fish vanish from stretches of river that seemed rich a week before. With every empty net, the jungle feels less like a challenge and more like a judge. Rations are cut from 2 meals to 1, then from full portions to half. Around the fire at night, men count how many days of food might be left if everyone were honest. How often, in a starving camp, is everyone really honest? Command starts to fray with the stomachs. On paper, the chain of authority is clear. Captain, officers, sergeants, soldiers. In the forest, soaked and exhausted, that line blurs. A leader who seemed impressive in a council chamber looks different when he is just another man covered in mud and insect bites. Some soldiers begin to whisper that he is lost. Others insist that doubt is worse than bad leadership. Is it mutiny to suggest turning back if no one can say for sure where back even is? Rivers, which once seemed like salvation, become the stage for these arguments. A wide channel built their hopes up. Faster travel, less cutting, more chance to rest blistered feet. But a river that bends the wrong way can waste 10 or 15 days before anyone accepts it. Each big curve raises a quiet question. Are we circling or moving forward? That no one wants to voice. How do you tell a new stretch of river from the old one when everything looks like a copy? Guides begin to vanish, one by one. Some slip away into the trees at dawn. The few who remain find themselves under harder eyes. Captains demand clearer answers, pointing swords at bare chests when directions falter. In truth, many of these guides have never walked the entire path they are describing. They know their own valleys and rivers, not some imagined straight line to a shining kingdom. How long can you force the land into the shape of a rumor before the land pushes back? As the months stretch on, the name El Dorado itself begins to change tone. It is no longer spoken with the bright, hungry excitement it had in Seville taverns. It comes out now in quieter, tighter ways, as a threat, as a justification, as a shield against admitting failure. When someone suggests turning toward more familiar ground, another hisses that you do not give up when you are this close to El Dorado. No one can prove that this close is real, but no one can prove that it isn't either, and that uncertainty is enough to keep tired legs moving. The men measure time in losses. Horse gone here, last dog there. They remember where they ate the horse. They mark when the dog died. One man sat on a riverbank, refused to rise. Even beaten, he wouldn't move. These aren't battles with trumpets. These are slow defeats in mud. Each one shaves away strength. At what point does an expedition stop being a group and become just individuals walking the same direction? Even the leaders feel the ground shifting under them. A captain who turns back too soon risks being called a coward and losing everything he invested. One who pushes too far risks losing most of his men and arriving home, if he arrives at all, as a ruin. Some start to make harsher choices to avoid either fate, hanging men they call deserters, seizing the last private food stores, forcing marches when rest would have been wiser. In trying so hard not to admit that the city may not exist, they edge closer to destroying the very people they need to reach it. By now, the short route that was sketched in clean ink in Spain has stretched into 1 year, then 2. The men can no longer picture the streets they left behind or the exact faces of those they promised to return to. All they have is the river in front of them, the mud beneath their feet, and a legend that has shifted from gift to burden. But some will go even further than this, trading doubt for cruelty and fear for rage. Now we turn to those moments when the dream of El Dorado stops merely exhausting its pursuers and begins to darken them, as leaders choose violence over truth and the search itself becomes a weapon. In one recorded march, a commander ordered more than 40 of his own men hanged or shot over the course of a single year. None of them died in a grand battle. They died on riverbanks and in clearings, punished for cowardice, insubordination, or simply asking to turn back. When the dream of El Dorado began, it promised riches and glory. How did it end with leaders killing the very people they needed to survive? The shift from desperate to destructive doesn't happen overnight. It starts when hunger, confusion, and time all begin to pull in different directions. The captain's orders say the route should have taken 6 months. The men know they have been on the trail for 12. Rations that were supposed to be stretched carefully are gone. Maps that once seemed precise now feel like guesses. When every promise from Spain has been quietly broken by the jungle, what is a leader supposed to lean on? Some choose fear. Picture a camp at dusk, after another long day pushing against the current. The men are exhausted, clothes still damp from the river, bellies half empty. One soldier, in a low voice, suggests they should turn back while they still can. The captain hears it and cannot afford, in his mind, to let that thought spread. He has one man tied to a tree and flogged, 20, 30, 50 lashes, until the backs of the others tighten. Does that whipping convince anyone they are closer to El Dorado, or only that their commander is more afraid than he looks? Once punishment becomes normal, it starts to move in darker directions. A man who collapses under fever is accused of laziness. A small group lingers to bury a friend and is called disobedient for delaying the march. The captain, who left Spain wanting to be remembered as bold, now fears being branded a failure more than anything else. If he turns around, the empty hands that come home will be his fault. If his men die on the trail, he can still blame the jungle, or the guides, or fate. In that twisted math, cruelty starts to look like a kind of proof. Mutiny grows in the same soil as obedience. Around small fires at the edge of camp, men talk in low voices about leaders who don't listen and routes that make no sense. Some start to keep small stashes of food hidden, just in case they decide to break away. Others quietly count which officers might side with them if they refused an order. When everyone fears everyone else, each rumor hits like a spark in dry grass. Is the traitor the man who talks about turning back, or the man who would rather see half his men die than admit he was wrong? The people who suffer earliest and most are often those who never believed in El Dorado at all. Local allies and guides, pulled or forced into the march, become convenient targets when days go wrong. A river that runs dry becomes their fault. A bend that leads to a swamp is proof, in the captain's eyes, of betrayal. Some are executed to send a message. Others are driven harder, made to walk ahead as if their bodies could absorb the danger first. What does a legend say about itself when it needs threats and ropes to keep its path alive? Small villages along the river pay a price too. At first, the expeditions trade in a rough way, beads and metal for food, shelter, information. As supplies run low and tempers rise, that balance shifts. Food is taken at sword point. Houses are burned as warnings. Men who once spoke of pacifying new lands now shout that fire will teach the locals to obey. These are the same men who once claimed to be bringing a new faith and new order. How far can someone drift from their own words before they stop recognizing themselves? Not every act of darkness is loud. Sometimes it is a quiet decision not to share the last dry bread with a sick companion. Sometimes it is a choice to adjust the record later. When battered survivors finally reach a colonial town, months or years after they were expected, they write reports to officials thousands of kilometers away. In those pages, they describe storms, ambushes, illness, treachery by guides. They rarely write that they starved villagers or killed their own men in anger, or chose to press on long after common sense said to stop. Whose version of events gets copied into the archive? The legend of El Dorado comes out of these reports almost untouched. Even when a journey ends in ruin, the city itself is never blamed. The commander will say that his men were weak, or his guides lied, or that enemies blocked his path. He may admit that he did not find the city, but he rarely says that the city is not there. In his letters, the Golden Lord is still waiting just beyond the last ridge, or just past the last bend in the river. Does that distance make the failure easier to live with? Over time, a strange split opens up. On one side is the hard reality of the marches. Bodies left unburied in the forest, rafts lost in floods, years spent wandering without result. On the other is the clean, simple idea of El Dorado, shining and untouchable, never quite pinned down to one place or one description. The stories of cruelty challenge accepted history because they don't fit the neat line of bold explorers seeking new lands. Yet these darker accounts often stay in the background while the golden name moves freely from tongue to tongue. The result is a kind of shadow. The more one expedition fails, the easier it becomes for someone else to say they went the wrong way and set out again. The suffering of the previous men becomes a warning, but not a verdict. The city, in their minds, floats free of any footprints, any graves, any burned villages. It becomes a destination that no disaster can ever quite erase. If the land and the rivers have said no a dozen times, why does the story still sound like maybe? By the time some of these commanders die, on the trail, in prison, or quietly in small colonial towns, their personal quests are over, but the myth they chased has already slipped out of their hands. It no longer belongs to a single column of men fighting its way along a single river. It belongs to everyone who hears the name and wants to place it somewhere. Now we leave the soaked camps and the broken rafts behind and step into quieter rooms lined with shelves where men with pens and compasses sit at tables and begin to fix El Dorado onto paper, moving it across the continent with ink and imagination until the city seems as real on the map as any place they have actually seen. By the 1590s, you could open an atlas in Europe and point to El Dorado on the page, even though no one had ever agreed where it actually was. In less than 70 years, a rumor whispered on riverbanks had turned into neat black letters printed on maps sold in bookshops. A city that might never have existed in stone now existed in ink. How does a place become real just because someone has drawn a line to it? Step into one of those rooms where the lines are made. The air smells of paper, lamp oil, and damp wool. A cartographer in Antwerp, Seville, or Venice sits at a heavy table, surrounded by charts and reports from the New World. He has never seen the Amazon or the Andes. He knows them as curves of coast, numbers for latitude, and phrases copied from tired handwriting. Yet when he dips his pen into ink and writes El Dorado on a blank patch of land, that decision quietly changes the story for everyone who sees it. The information he works with is messy. One letter from a failed expedition describes a rich plateau beyond the northern Andes. Another speaks of great lakes deep in the interior. A third mentions a powerful ruler somewhere in the forests of Guyana. Each writer insists his version is true. The cartographer cannot draw all of them at once without his map turning to noise. So he chooses one, or blends them, and fixes the legend in place for a while. How many doubts are flattened every time a guess is inked as a fact? On early maps, El Dorado sometimes sits high in the mountains, not far from the lands of the Muisca. On later ones, it slides east toward the vast rivers of the Amazon basin. In some charts, it appears in Guyana, near a mysterious inland lake. In others, it hovers near the headwaters of a great river system. Across a single century, the same name travels more than 2,000 kilometers on paper without moving an inch in reality. What does it mean when a city wanders more than an army ever could? These mapmakers are not always cynical. Many see themselves as bringing order to confusion. The coastlines they draw are based on soundings, bearings, and the hard work of pilots. They know which ports lie at which degrees of latitude, how many days sail separate two harbors. Inside the continent, though, there are no such anchors. Rivers twist, mountains are glimpsed from far away, reports contradict each other. The temptation is always to smooth the unknown into something that feels solid. Where does careful synthesis end and comfortable fiction begin? Chroniclers join in from the safety of their desks. Some are priests compiling histories of the Indies, others are royal officials assembling reports. A few have crossed the ocean, many have not. They read letters from captains who insist they were close to the Golden Land, from soldiers who describe great wealth just beyond the mountains, from merchants who heard second-hand accounts in dockside taverns. To make a readable story, they must choose. They cut details that clash, tidy timelines, and settle on one location for a moving dream. How many alternative El Dorados disappear in the margins when one version is chosen for the page? For the people who read these books and maps, El Dorado starts to feel less like a rumor and more like a destination. A merchant in Seville traces a finger along a river drawn in thin blue, past a symbol for mountains, to a small mark labeled with the golden name. A young soldier sees the same mark and imagines himself standing there, sword at his side, watching the sun flash off towers no one has yet found. The map is not just an image. It is a promise that the world can be known if you walk far enough. How many journeys begin not in the jungle, but in that quiet moment of looking down at a page? Not everyone is convinced. A few writers, comparing stories, notice how often the city seems to shift. One account places it firmly in the highlands, another in lowland forests, another by a lake with no clear location. They remark in cautious phrases that the reports do not agree. Some even suggest that greed and fear might be shaping what men say they have seen. But those cooler voices are quietly dismissed by scholars who prefer clear lines to uncertainty. Is it any surprise that the neat symbol on the map outlives the doubts that once surrounded it? As more maps are printed, dozens, then hundreds, the presence of El Dorado on them starts to act like evidence in itself. If it were not real, someone might say, why would so many charts show it? The logic runs in circles, but it feels firm. Each new engraving borrows authority from the last. The legend becomes a kind of echo chamber, bouncing between explorers' reports, chroniclers' books, and cartographers' plates until it sounds like established fact. How do you argue with a city you can point to, even if it only exists as ink? Yet beneath the confidence of these images lies a simple truth. Many of the men drawing El Dorado had more information about coastlines than about the lake at the center of the legend. They knew how deep certain harbors were, how long a crossing took in good winds, how high a familiar cape rose from the sea. The sacred lakes of the high plateau, the muddy basins of the interior, the real places where gold and offerings sank, those remained distant, half-heard. The maps could make the city look fixed. They could not make the earth match it. By the time the legend is fully established on paper, the balance between story and soil has quietly flipped. The city no longer needs successful expeditions to stay alive. It needs only writers and engravers willing to keep drawing it in. The jungle may have rejected dozens of marches. Rivers may have swallowed rafts and men, but the symbol on the map stays crisp. To test that symbol, someone will have to leave the study and return to the water itself. Now we turn back from ink and chart lines to a single real lake in the Andes where engineers, treasure hunters, and later archaeologists will cut into the earth and drain the water, looking for the gold that was truly thrown away, and for the gap between a ritual's muddy floor and a metropolis that never stood on its shores. In the late 1500s, an entrepreneur named Antonio de Sepulveda spent more than a decade trying to cut a notch into the side of a lake high in the Andes, just to make the water go away. Lake Guatavita sits at roughly 3,000 meters above sea level, yet men hauled tools up there and carved a trench about 50 meters long into the crater wall, all in the hope that the mud at the bottom held enough gold to change their lives. Stand on the shore with them for a moment. The water is cold and still, sitting in a near-perfect circle, hugged by steep slopes. Sepulveda's workers dig day after day, cutting a channel deeper and deeper through rock and earth. At first, nothing seems to happen. Then, slowly, the level of the lake begins to fall. Water slides toward the cut, gathers, and finally spills over in a brown, rushing sheet. The lake that once mirrored the sky starts to lean, showing a muddy rim that no one has seen in generations. How must it feel to watch a sacred mirror draining away under your orders? As the water retreats, the work only grows harder. The exposed mud at the edges is thick and sucking. Men sink past their ankles, then their knees, as they try to reach the new shoreline. Wooden planks are laid, then swallowed. Some accounts say the lake dropped by several meters. Others suggest as much as 20. In either case, a wide band of the basin is suddenly bare. This is the moment the treasure hunters have been telling each other about for years. If untold wealth was truly thrown into this lake for centuries, shouldn't it be lying here now, waiting? They do find gold, but not in the way the legend promised. Scattered in the mud are small objects, pendants, earrings, tiny figures, thin sheets of worked metal. Many are delicate, barely a few centimeters across. Some are damaged from centuries under silt. There are emeralds too, but nowhere near the mountains of gemstones that tavern stories had described. The workers scrape and dig, filling baskets, hoping each new patch of mud will reveal the hoard that justifies all this effort. How many times can you tell yourself that the real cache must be a little deeper before doubt starts to creep in? There is another problem. The mud begins to dry and crack in the sun, then harden like cement. The deeper they go, the more the walls around the drained portion crumble. Landslides send earth back into the basin, half burying men and breaking tools. The work becomes more dangerous, less productive. At some point, no one can name the exact day, the balance flips. The gold and emeralds coming out no longer match the energy and money going in. For Sepulveda, the dream of Guatavita as an open vault quietly breaks against the physics of water and earth. Centuries later, in the 1890s, another attempt arrives with new technology. This time, a British company brings steam pumps and modern equipment up the same narrow roads. They cut a deeper channel, drive pipes into the water, and set the pumps chugging for months. The lake shrinks again, exposing more of its bed. From a distance, it must have looked like a patient being bled, the water trickling away in a controlled wound. Did anyone on those slopes feel that they were repeating an old story in a new costume? The results are strangely similar. Again, small objects appear. Gold ornaments, fragments, bits of worked metal pulled from thick, resistant mud. Some are beautiful, intricate examples of Muisca craftsmanship. They confirm that offerings really were thrown into the lake over long periods of time. They show that the ceremony of the Gilded Man was not just a tale, but there is no solid floor of gold, no hidden metropolis collapsed into the water, no city in the mud waiting to be excavated. How do you adjust your expectations when the evidence gives you truth, but not the version you wanted? Modern archaeologists arrive with a different kind of treasure in mind. Instead of trying to drain the entire basin, they take cores of sediment, examine pollen, study the distribution of offerings around the lake's edge. They find patterns, concentrations of metal in certain sectors, traces of repeated human activity, and layers of soil that match periods of ritual use. The numbers they care about are not how many ingots can be sold, but how many centuries the practice continued. The data quietly reminds us that the Muisca were feeding the lake with meaning, not hiding a city inside it. Some archaeologists walk the nearby hills and find smaller lakes and wetlands that also show signs of offerings. Tiny gold pieces, ceramic fragments, ritual traces. El Dorado, in this light, looks less like a single spot and more like part of a network of sacred places spread across a landscape. There was no capital of gold built from solid metal. There was a culture that saw certain waters as thresholds and used gold as a language of respect. Why isn't this taught more clearly when it challenges the picture many of us quietly carry from childhood stories? And yet, the physical finds at Guatavita don't kill the legend. If anything, they give it new fuel. Museums in Bogotá and elsewhere display the recovered pieces. Gleaming rafts, tiny figures, delicate sheets of metal that once flashed briefly on water before sinking. Visitors stand in front of glass cases, reading dates and descriptions. They nod at labels that say ritual offering, and then, almost without realizing, some still imagine the rest, the parts that were never there. How easily do our minds turn many offerings over time back into somewhere a huge pile must still be waiting. Today, Guatavita is often described in calm terms. A protected site, a place of cultural heritage, a key to understanding Muisca cosmology. The notch Sepulveda cut is still visible, softened by centuries. The water has long since risen again, closing over the scars of pumps and trenches. Standing at the rim, you see a quiet surface and a ring of green, not the wound of a drained basin. The lake has returned to something like its old shape, even if the stories swirling around it have not. What the bottom of Guatavita actually shows us is simple and, in its own way, more powerful than the old fantasy. There was a golden ceremony, there were offerings, people really did stand on rafts covered in dust and pour metal and emeralds into the water for reasons that were not about greed. There was no hidden metropolis, no endless vault of coins, no solid walls of gold sunk beneath the waves. The earth has answered the question, was there ever a golden ritual? More clearly than it has answered, where is the city? And so we step away from the lake's edge with a different mystery in front of us. If the city of El Dorado never stood in stone and timber, if the lake holds offerings instead of a palace, why did so many people across so many years need to believe in a single perfect place where all the gold waited together? Now we turn inward, leaving the mud and water behind, to walk through the landscape of the human mind itself, where El Dorado survives not as a point on a map, but as a shape our hopes and fears keep drawing whenever we think we are just one chance away from everything changing. In 1849, more than 80,000 people rushed toward California, convinced that a field, a riverbank, or a single stream bed might change their lives forever. 3 centuries earlier, men were hacking through jungle chasing a golden man in the mountains of Colombia. Different continents, different years, same feeling. The belief that somewhere out there, just beyond what you know, there is a place where everything is finally enough. Why does that picture keep pulling us forward? By now in our story, the jungle and the lake are familiar. We've watched men march, starve, argue, and drain water out of a crater for a legend that never quite solidified. The physical El Dorado has cracked under the weight of real rivers, real mud, and real distance. But something interesting survives when the city itself fades. The desire at the center of it doesn't vanish with the maps, it simply changes clothes. Think about what El Dorado actually promises. Not just gold, but concentration. All the gold in one place. One city, one lake, one valley, where the world's scattered chances are gathered into a single, decisive point. You don't have to live carefully for decades. You don't have to accept small wins. You just have to reach that spot, open that door, stand on that shore. It's a shortcut dream. How different is that, really, from a miner staring at a river pan in 1849 or a trader staring at a rising stock in 1999? Across history, you can see the same pattern appear with new names. In the California Gold Rush, in less than 10 years, roughly 300,000 people moved toward a region that had been sparsely settled before word of flakes, in a mill race spread. In the Klondike, around 100,000 set out for the Yukon, maybe 30,000 actually reached the goldfields. Most never struck it rich. Still, ships kept sailing north. Why do so many people repeat the same curve, hear a story, picture themselves as the exception, and walk straight into the risk? Part of the answer lies in how our minds handle almost. A legend like El Dorado rarely says, "There is no hope." It says, "Others failed, but they were weak, they turned back too soon, they went the wrong way." The story leaves a gap where you can insert yourself. Gold rush posters, investment pamphlets, overheard bar conversations, they all work the same way. They hint that the big chance is still open. That quiet suggestion can be more powerful than any command. Another part lies in how we remember rewards and losses. A single tale of a man who found a rich vein or came home with saddlebags full of nuggets stays sharp in memory. Hundreds of nameless marchers who vanished on the trail blur together. The mind quietly weights the visible success more heavily than the invisible cost. The same instinct that once sent men after El Dorado later fuels tulip booms, housing bubbles, and speculative frenzies that no one expected to collapse. Is it any surprise that we keep walking toward the glitter and looking away from the mud? El Dorado also taps into a more personal hope, the belief in just one more chance, one more expedition before you're too old, one more voyage before your debts catch you, one more investment before you're stuck in the life you already know. You don't have to be a conquistador or a gold miner to feel that pull. It shows up in quieter ways. One more exam that will fix everything. One more move to a new city, one more business that surely won't fail like the last one. How often do we tell ourselves that the next bend, not the path itself, is what matters? If you look closely, El Dorado sits at the crossroads of two human habits, wanting more than we have and wanting it in a single decisive moment. Slow, steady gains feel small and fragile. A sudden windfall feels like a story we can tell. That's why so many golden dreams are framed as turning points. Strikes, booms, jackpots, once-in-a-lifetime chances. The legend whispers that life doesn't have to be a long road. It can be a door. What happens when we start to measure our worth against doors that may not even exist? And yet, there is another side to this city in the mind. The same imagination that leads people into danger can also help them endure hard years. For a hungry marcher on a riverbank, the idea of a shining city ahead might be the only thing that gets him through the night. For a miner in a freezing camp, dreams of a rich claim can make one more day of digging tolerable. Even in modern lives, hope for something better keeps people studying, saving, building, trying. Can we really separate the damage caused by these dreams from the strength they sometimes give? When we compare all these echoes, El Dorado, gold rushes, market bubbles, private fantasies, we start to see the legend less as a mistake and more as a mirror. It reflects back our tendency to chase concentrated happiness, to imagine that there must be a place or a moment where everything lines up. It also reflects our difficulty in accepting limits, randomness, and the slow work of building a life in pieces instead of discovering it all at once. The city on the map may be false, but the desires that drew the lines are very real. By the time we reach this point in the story, the physical search is over. The jungle has said no in 100 ways. The lake has given up offerings, but not a palace. The maps have shifted the city around until the contradiction is hard to ignore. El Dorado, as a place you can ride into and conquer, doesn't hold. But El Dorado as a pattern in human thought, as that repeating shape of just over there, just one more chance, is still very much alive. Maybe that is why the legend refuses to fade, even when the geography has stopped cooperating. So, as we move toward the end of this journey, the question changes. It's no longer, where was El Dorado, or even, did it exist at all? Instead, it becomes, what did we really go looking for when we set out toward it? Was it gold, or a way to escape time, fear, and ordinary days? Now we walk back in our minds to where we began, to still water in the mountains, to a quiet lake that has watched all these hopes come and go, and we let the noise of marches and markets fall away, so that in the final chapter we can simply sit with the legend itself as night gathers around it. For almost 500 years after the first Spanish reports in the 1530s, no one has been able to ride into a valley, touch a wall, and say, "This is El Dorado." No ruins, no golden avenues, no buried metropolis have ever appeared. And yet the legend is still alive, whispered, filmed, written, and dreamed. How can a city that never stood in stone refuse to die? Picture night falling over the high Andes. The air is thin and cold at nearly 3,000 meters. The last color drains from the sky, leaving a pale band of light behind dark mountains. Below lies a still lake, almost perfectly round, its surface black and quiet. No rafts move, no fires burn. Yet if you listen, can you almost hear the faint memory of water against wood? Once, in that memory, a Muisca ruler stood on a raft, his skin covered in gold dust catching the first gray of dawn. Around him, attendants held offerings, small figures, pendants, emeralds that would soon vanish into the water. The ritual was not about getting rich. It was about giving something precious away. What kind of worldview throws beauty into the depths and calls it balance, not loss? Generations later, strangers arrived who could not imagine that choice. To them, gold was not a language with the gods. It was something to melt, count, and spend. They heard fragments, dust on skin, offerings in water, and their minds filled in the rest. A gilded man became a golden city. A ceremony became a vault. In letters and taverns, they built a metropolis out of words. How many legends begin as a simple misunderstanding of someone else's sacred act? We followed those words down from the plateau, into forests and along rivers. We watched columns of men push through heat and mud, always convinced that El Dorado lay just beyond the ridge they hadn't climbed yet, the bend they hadn't rounded. Hunger hollowed them. Fear sharpened their leaders. In the end, the jungle gave them sickness, arguments, and silence, but never the shining streets they imagined. How much of that suffering belonged to the land, and how much to the dreams they carried into it? When boots and rafts failed, ink took over. Map by map, decade by decade, The city moved across the continent without leaving a footprint, pinned to the Andes on one chart, drifting more than 2,000 kilometers toward the Guiana Highlands on another. At Lake Guatavita, men tried to force an answer from the earth itself, cutting channels and running pumps to drop the water level meter by meter. The mud they exposed held delicate offerings, not a drowned palace. Modern archaeology later confirmed the golden ritual and refused the myth of a metropolis. The evidence quietly challenges accepted history, yet the older picture lingers. In museums, you can stand before a golden raft barely longer than your hand, tiny figures frozen mid-ceremony above a stylized lake. The labels talk about the Muisca, about offerings, about a worldview where gold was a bridge, not a prize. Visitors nod, read the dates, and move on. But inside, some part of the old El Dorado flickers, the sense that if this much beauty survives in glass, there must have been far more somewhere else. Why isn't this taught as a story where the truth is not less than the legend, only different? By now, the physical search is over. The jungle has said no in 100 ways. The lake has given up fragments, not walls. The maps have shifted the city until the contradiction is hard to ignore. What remains is the city in the human mind. Its outline is familiar, a single place or moment where all your scattered hopes finally gather, where effort suddenly turns into enough. Maybe it's a discovery, a business, a move, a relationship. Have you felt your own version shimmer just out of reach? Seen that way, El Dorado is not a failed destination. It is a shape our desires fall into when life feels uncertain. It reminds us how easily we trade slow, steady gains for the promise of one perfect leap. It also shows how strong that longing can be, strong enough to send men across oceans, through forests, over mountains, and into the pages of books and charts. The city on the map may not exist, but the feelings that drew its outline are very real. How often do your thoughts drift toward just one more chance? Now we are back where we began, by still water in the mountains, under a sky that has watched all of this come and go. The raft is memory. The torches have gone out. Armor and weapons lie far away in cases and ruins. What remains is the surface of the lake, the quiet line of hills, and the thought of a golden man who walked into the mist and never fully came back out of our imagination. Some questions are not meant to be closed. They are meant to rest beside us. As you settle into the darkness of your own room, you don't need to solve El Dorado. You don't need to decide how real it was. You can let the pieces we've gathered, ritual and rumor, maps and rivers, greed and longing, float past like reflections on water. If your mind wants to wander again along an old jungle path, or stand once more on the rim of that lake, it can do so without hurry. The city that never existed in stone has done what many real cities cannot. It has lived for centuries without crumbling, carried in stories and half-remembered dreams. As you rest now, let El Dorado slip gently into the background, not as a place anyone failed to find, but as a soft question shining somewhere between history and dream. And if, in the quiet of the night, your thoughts return to that still water and that faint golden glow, that's all right. Some cities are meant to exist only there,